Be ready to get your Ultra Galaxy fix with this new tutorial requested by Patreon supporter Gojira91. Let's dive straight in. Today we're recreating Gomora's super oscillatory wave, covering everything from the charging up to the wave itself. This shot is very simple and contains some 3D camera motion to track objects in. First thing I did was work on the energy that would charge in Gomora's crests. I created a new solid and added a fractal noise effect. I changed the fractal type to dynamic progressive for a more energy-like look to it. I set the blend mode to screen and made it a 3D layer so the energy would be tracked to the camera movement. I then made a rough mask around Gomora's crests and hand-tracked the fractal noise layer to his head, making adjustments in the masks when needed. It didn't have to be perfect because the masks would be heavily feathered later on, meaning a few slip-ups in the tracking wouldn't be that noticeable. Then to create the effect of energy flowing through these horns, I animated the Y value of the fractal noise's offset turbulence adjustment, fine-tuning until I found a speed with which I was happy. I had it continuously flowing throughout the whole shot. Then I began constructing the final look for the energy. I added a CC toner effect and set the midtones to sort of an orangish pinkish color. The color of this effect varies from being more pink and red in Ultra Galaxy to a pure orange and rube, so I just went for what looked best to me. Then I added a vector blur to crush in the highlights a bit, some CC force motion blur, and a fast box blur to tie it all together and give this a very fluid energy type look. And finally some glow to make it pop a bit. Next I did relatively the same thing for Gomora's front horn. I just animated a quick mask to roughly follow the shape of Gomora's horn, and added another instance of CC toner to give it that same pinkish orange look as the crests. I animated the opacity of the horn layer, and animated the brightness on the fractal noise to have them fade in as the attack charged. Next came the admittedly tedious but well worth it process of making some lightning type energy surging through Gomora's crests and into his horn. I made a new solid with an instance of advanced lightning, and I set the mode to strike. This lets me have complete control over the origin and endpoints of the bolt so we can place it wherever we want. I set a couple keyframes in its animation, one to change its conductivity state from frame 1 to frame 2, and another to reduce its opacity from 100 to 0 a few frames after that. Super simple, and it adds some nice motion and realism to the bolt. I set it to be a 3D layer so that it would still be properly tracked for the few frames that it was active. I didn't need to animate its position otherwise. Then I duplicated a whole bunch of these and I offset them in the timeline by varying amounts, and repositioned them all to create a huge variety of lightning stringing throughout Gomora's crests, and some that jump from his crests to his front horn. I pre-composed all the lightning bolts together and, whoa, they're not really tracked properly, but don't worry, all we have to do is toggle the Collapse Transformations box in the Switches and Modes section by the timeline, the one that kinda looks like a weird gear when you click it. Turning this on will preserve all of our blending modes and camera movement that was lost in the pre-composition process. It took a short bit, but the end result for all this lightning gives the effect a nice bit of added flair, and it sort of gives the illusion that the energy forming in the crests is being transferred into the horn when it gets fired. Now let's finally move on to the actual oscillatory wave itself. I'll quickly show you two variations of how I'd go about it, one utilizing a paid third-party plugin, and one you can do completely vanilla inside of After Effects. Using Trapcode Mirror from Red Giant, we can create a real 3D fractal that we can completely customize and have total control over. This would be my go-to method for making the oscillatory wave in this scenario, since I feel it gives the closest and best looking result in comparison to the show. I won't go over the whole exact process of how I did it since it's a lot of experimentation, and I'm sure most folks watching this don't really have this plugin yet. But basically I manipulated the size of the fractal into more of a straight beam shape, and animated the scroll X on the fractal settings, similar to animating the offset turbulent on the fractal noise we did earlier. Then I tracked the beam to the horn and did some more fine tuning in the amplitude and frequency settings on the fractal, until I found a look that I was happy with. I colorized it with CC toner, a bit of vector blur and glow, and that's it. So for not a whole lot of effort, that looks really good. Now let's take a look at making something similar using base After Effects. It'll be a bit more time consuming, but it'll still look really good in the end. I would normally use something like a particle system to create this beam, but today I want to show you a method of making beams that lets you have just a bit more control over their appearance that can be really helpful in some cases. I created a new solid and made a rectangular mask so that we get a bit more of a beam-shaped rectangle. I pre-composed that layer and added an instance of roughen edges to the layer. Gonna be straightforward here. A lot of this going forward is dependent on your own experimentation and preferences of how you want the beam to look, so I'll mainly be touching on some of the tips and steps that I took here. I set the roughen edges mode to spiky and increased the border amount by a fair bit. I played with the scale settings some until I found a shape that looked roughly like a beam. Like we've been doing, I keyframed the offset turbulent setting and moved the X value up a good bit. Once I had a general system I was happy with, I duplicated this layer a few times and altered the roughen edges to get different sorts of particles and energies flowing through the beam. And I even added some turbulent displacement to make it seem a bit wavier. I toyed around with all these layers for a while until I found a look that roughly matched the look of the oscillatory wave from the shows. Once I was satisfied, I pre-composed them all. Make sure to hit that collapse transformation button again, and yada yada, CC toner, vector blur, glow, and some directional blur to make it fit in a bit nicer and add some motion blur. It's not quite as three-dimensional or cool looking as the mirror version, but with even more layering and experimentation, you can certainly create some great looking beam variations using roughen edges and turbulent displacement. Lastly, let's touch on the little sonic waves that travel through the beam. No clue if these have a specific name, but they're these very defined circular discs that travel through the oscillatory wave, presumably to break rocks or something. I don't know, I'm not a zoologist. So to recreate these, I simply made a new solid and I added 2 circular masks. You can make sure these are perfect circles in the center of the frame by holding down Ctrl, Shift, and Alt as you drag the mask. Utilizing a similar combination of some roughen edges and vector blur, we can make some very energized looking discs. Making these into 3D objects and doing a simple position animation lets us get these moving along the beam very nicely. Then I added some of my own touches as usual. Shockwaves when the beam is fired off from Film Ride's Infinity Pack, some camera shake, a subtle lens flare, you probably know the usual by now, Red Giant Super Comp, the works. So today I really hope some of the cool lessons you took away were related to learning how to use effects like fractal noise, turbulent displacement, and roughen edges in order to create some real energy, and beam elements without having to work through a potentially complex and resource-intensive particle system. Using base After Effects, and a third-party plugin if you want to be a cool cat, we were able to make this really cool show-accurate oscillatory wave. So thanks for watching. If you want to get a tutorial made for a kaiju-related effect of your choice, head on over to patreon.com/DaikaijuLegends, where you can get that, as well as access to our entire library of KaijuVFX elements. We just released a pack of 21 finisher moves inspired by classic Showa Ultraman to our $5 supporters, so be sure to check that out. And happy compositing! I'll catch you here next time. Big thanks as always to all of our Patreon supporters, including Jaws Infinity, Project Godzilla, Goji73, Justice, Riverlane, Godzilla Productions TV, Professor Kaiju, Asusa Productions, The Toho Society, Asriel, Gomzilla 1985, The Immortal Red Fox, Neil Not Neil Thompson, Eric Trin, Inaba, The Rabid Walrus, Ultraman Ultimo, Scry, Ultriob, Jeff King, Johnny Sacco, Andrew S., Saint Nick, Gojira91, Palmerbash, Dustin Beetle and The Next Decade Props and Costumes, William Zorio, GWR Zilla, Hayden Bell, and Deadzilla.